Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Brown with Daxco, and we are so excited that you have joined us for the August and September review of the Insights and Impact Report. Before we dig in, I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping updates that you're used to hearing, but everyone has been muted to cut down on background noise. We ask that and encourage you to send in your questions and your comments and your thoughts, because we're going to be interactive today in the chat. Or the Q&A, and we'll kind of talk through those as we work through our review of our Insights and Impact Report. So with that, just in case we have some new faces that haven't joined us in for last month's webinar, really I wanted to give a quick summary before digging into what our Insights and Impact Report is. So at the start of the pandemic, we recognized, was before the start of the pandemic, but particularly heightened at the start of the pandemic, we realized the need of our customers to have a monthly resource to continually track how the movement as a whole is recovering. What does progress look like month over month by revenue size, so that you could really compare your growth and recovery to your peers. And as a result, we launched our monthly Insights and Impact Report. You can find it each month around the 15th is when we push it out on the daxco.com page under Resources and Insights. So we send it out each month in an email, but if you ever just wanted to check in on daxco.com and dig in, we have that report for you. And then every other month we have a webinar where we bring, who is my co-host today, Constance Miller, onto the webinar to dig in and share her data knowledge, share her knowledge of the movement as a whole, and then also kind of dig into, based off of her data expertise, what she's seeing, what are some things that we need to be looking for. So we're going to dig into some check-ins revenue, membership, registrations, the whole shebang. After each section, we're going to ask you a couple of questions. So be ready to share your thoughts. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining us. Constance, welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to dig in because we're reviewing 2 months of data. So it was definitely a big 2 months for recovery wise, and wanted to open up and see, okay, we have revenue that we've looked at the last 2 months, and we saw an almost, we saw a really big increase in percent back to normal between the 2 months, but we've actually seen a decrease in total revenue between the 2 months, and wanted to kind of kick us off by saying, first, what's calculated in gross revenue? And then second, why are those numbers kind of telling different stories?
Yes, so these are excellent questions. I will do my best to cover them all. There's a lot going on here. Probably for those experts who are living this every day, no surprises, but there is definitely an interesting story happening. And I think where you started is very key. You mentioned this is a 2-month review, and those 2 months just happen to be a turnover of what would normally be a season. If we can talk about kind of seasonality within typical, I mean, we're all very familiar, most schools start in August or September, and this often coincides with just different interactions with the Y in general, as well as programming offerings. Now, this year obviously has a different headline to it. So in addition to the normal seasonality of going from summer months to school months, going from summer programming to school programming or fall programming, we also in the middle of this have varying levels of openness, reclosures, a re-envisioned programming for the fall that maybe instead of, for instance, a very, very common one that we're hearing some great stories about is instead of before and after care programming, it may be all day school age programming, that being one example of many. And so essentially those are the major headlines that we see happening here. To answer your question about what constitutes gross revenue, This is truly anything that is logged and recognized as revenue in the front end of operations across all of our customers. So if you are logging membership dues, even one-time fees, recurring fees, if you're once you recognize pledges, if you happen to use fundraising module of operations, programs, again, recurring registrations and fees, and certainly childcare and camp. So it is also, I should say, adjusted for discounts. So if it is, for instance, a $100 membership that has a discount group that discounts at $20, that's not inflated here. It would be the net result of that. So that would be $80 of gross revenue in this case. So there very much is everything that is recognized as revenue in operations minus discounts and adjustments. So we're not experiencing inflation in that sense. One of the other things, again, because there's a lot to unpack in this answer, I feel like we could have a webinar completely on revenue. One of the last headlines that I will mention about it is that you just heard me say discounts and adjustments. And forgive me if you're seeing flashes of light. I happen to sit near a lovely window and we're having some afternoon sun that's coming and going. So let me adjust briefly. But that we've got experts on the call listening to this and who know exactly what I'm about to say. Remember, in addition to how we are serving our communities changing, all of the decisions that everyone has made since March, that's still flowing. So by that, I mean, we may have more discount groups. We may have, maybe I was on a full pay membership and now I'm on a discounted membership. Maybe I've come off hold. Maybe I've been moved into, let's say, a different membership type than I was, and the fees associated with what I would normally pay, the why have changed for whatever reason. Sometimes those are stories where we've got additional generosity. I am now a donor as well as a member, and sometimes there's certainly to make sure that we're still serving our entire community. And when I'm going from what may have been a full pay membership to a discounted membership of some kind or a waived fee. So all of those things are moving. We see them moving every week, every month. As Wise and J's based on what their community needs and their level of openness are making those decisions.
I think that's a really great point, and we're going to see that in some images here. But when it comes to like revenue composition, it just keeps shifting, rightfully,
Yes.
because seasonality is normal for our Wise, J's, and community centers. So before we dig into the next topic with revenue, we got a question that was asking, are grants and PPE included in that?
Oh, that's such an excellent question. Thank you for whoever asked that. So if you in any way recognize a grant or a relationship with any kind of organizational funding, and you recognize it and have it set up in operations as a subsidy, so for instance, or a reimbursement, and that is set up in there, it will show. So for instance, like I'm getting paid from, let's say, my employer for this membership, and I go to the Y and I'm not paying for it, who I work for is, and it's a subsidy relationship, that should show. If it is a grant though, and I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think, Christy, when you and I were looking at these numbers, this topic came up. So I'm so glad someone asked. If it is not, again, affecting how you would be paid for that direct membership or reimbursed for it up front in the system, and it is truly a state grant, a local grant, a federal grant that wouldn't make its way into operations just based on how you receive those funds and spend those funds, then no, it would not be, because there isn't a grant management function that is brought in. So I will be, rather than just that being an easy yes or no, I do want to caveat it and say the answer for anything related to revenue will always be, if your organization puts it in operations, how you run your membership, how you run your GLs, your finances, it's in here, because you're having to attach a GL to it. If you don't, based on how you consume those grants and spend those grants, which there's several great examples of that where it wouldn't make sense to, then it is not. So it's truly, where you are managing that money and how that affects your GL tracking and your accounting tracking. If it's in operations, it's included. And if it's a grant that wouldn't make any sense to ever put in a member management system of this kind, then it would be outside of it. Correct.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So these are the total numbers percent back to normal for the movement of all of our YMCA and JCC customers together. Let's look at it by revenue size, because those are telling some interesting stories. For
Yes,
instance,
this is in a very important breakdown.
so I wanted to just, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but wanted to kind of pick your brain on what your main takeaways are here.
Yes, so there is a lot to unpack here. Again, I think I mentioned earlier we could do an entire webinar on revenue and what we've been seeing. So again, I'm happy to ask folks who are listening and following along as you have other questions, because there's no way I can cover all of this. So if there's something that I'm just going to leave with that caveat. If there is something that is piquing your interest or you're noticing, we love those chats. So I'm going to start there. Now, the things to note here are a couple pieces. I think we covered this in the last webinar, but it bears repeated. Why these breakouts? So why these 4 columns is something I really want to stress. And essentially what we are doing is very much looking at the data and what is moving together and the types of organizations that are acting similarly. And so these are not arbitrary groups to that end. And we also very much want to in addition to kind of say, hey, what's grouping together here in terms of size and therefore behavior. In addition to that, we know that there are several, Ys and Js who identify in terms of, hey, these are organizations like me as well. So we've done a lot of talking with our partners and those organizations that we serve and work with about kind of why these 4. So I just want to give a nod to that. Now, the data itself. You'll see in August, there's an outlier, and in September, there's an outlier, and they've switched. So let's talk about that. So if you were looking at this and we were in a stats class, there's several different things. If you were asking me on an essay question, what is the outlier in August and why, and what is appearing to be an outlier or a trend in September or why? So those are the 2 questions I'm going to answer. August. All right, we've got very much at a glance, there's some variance, but those, all of the organizations that are approximately, under 20 million or in a set, they're in a 9-point spread in terms of compared to their overall revenue, again, from what we know in operations compared to last year. There is a much lower percentage year over year for the largest group, so the large and extra large organizations, for lack of a better way to kind of summarize that. What is happening here is, again, probably it's very intuitive. The data is just bearing out a very intuitive story about what was happening here. So throughout the summer, as you can imagine, the larger the organization, not only the more locations they tend to have, but they tend to serve a very broad community. So it's very much a stretch of serving urban communities and suburban communities. These tend to be, an urban and suburb or a very large suburban metro area. That is part of it. This means that they tend to have very high membership base as well as programming. So that all is, we all know that. But it also means that they tended to do 2 important things. One is there were lots of holds. There are lots of discounts. They had potentially higher churn, depending on the organization when you separate this out, as well as serving as emergency childcare centers. All of those things affected revenue. So when I'm serving in an emergency capacity, I'm charging a low or no fee. And that affected everyone across the board. It was just disproportionately affecting the revenue the larger the organization. So that kind of story bore through kind of when we saw school start. So September looks pretty different. When you look at those revenue numbers, something's happened. Now remember, this is compared to September last year. So August this year compared to last year, because again, we have highly typical seasonal behavior, September this year compared to last year. So what's going on here? And it goes back to really where we started the theme of kicking off this webinar, which is we turned over a season. And you'll see that the smaller the organization, the greater percentage back to normal compared to, again, just September. And this is truly, we're seeing this repeatedly in the childcare, the camp and childcare line. Yeah. That's not everybody's story. If you're certainly on the webinar and saying, hey, that doesn't apply to us, we absolutely see exceptions to that. But the overall trend here is that everybody saw, compared to last year, an increase in percent back to normal. Look at that. Like everybody went up. And the people who went up the most, it's the most common reason for this is charging for childcare, charging for school age programming. So as we mentioned earlier, we've got things like, I know we've got some wonderful examples of a program called Y Academy, where we've got, virtual school support options. Maybe what would have been before and after school is now daycare, or concept of that, et cetera. And so that's, again, there's more going on there, but that is very much the most common answer.
We have a question in the Q&A, and I think that flows in nicely, is like, what's driving this year-over-year revenue improvement? And you touched on it, childcare. And when we first saw that 107%, we were like, why? Dug into like, what's going on here? Not that we aren't happy, but we just wanted to be able to answer why. And the seasonality of it is that most registration fees were happening in the summertime when they registered versus September, but because our schools are opening at different times in different states, that's impacting the year-over-year comparison. So childcare is
so glad you brought this up. I'm so glad you brought that up. I that is absolutely a detail which we should, put a exclamation point on. It is not simply that we're offering childcare, or that you're exactly right. It's when those registration fees are hitting, or when payments are hitting for it that would normally be spread out over another time. Absolutely correct. Yep.
This is unrelated to revenue, but I did want to answer. We got a question from Brianna that said that the downloadable charts are not available for September. That I will make sure prior to sending out the follow-up that we get that downloadable chart on there. The reason is we actually restructured it a little bit on our website, so it was easier to find for you guys, and that was just a miss on our part. So I'll make sure before I send the email out that you can get access to it. Good question. So looking at this comparison, I wanted us to talk about composition, because we have been digging into a lot about childcare kind of being the name of the game. And I think this shows that really well. Having worked in the movement for a while, what are some things that stand out on these comparisons?
It's moving together. So if you look at August compared to September, you'll immediately see some differences. I mean, that over a month is moving together, and I'll tell you what I mean by that is where it's getting everybody's diversification looks different, but proportionally you can see like, okay, everybody's kind of going from big childcare camp revenue in August to more membership, less of that in September, et cetera. So there's trends across that. That's one. The other one is exactly what you said before you came to this slide, which is we've got some broken, still seasonality, but it's broken, mistimed, delayed seasonality, which is impacting this. And the third thing is look at that other fee. Do you see that? That light blue that went up? That is another piece when to really call out, and you, depending on again how you choose to set up one-time fees or registration fees, sometimes those show up and it's truly an implementation choice as attached to like a program, and sometimes they're their own in kind of a miscellaneous bucket for whatever reason. And so I think the things that stand out to me really are like, okay, we've got different stories here by revenue types, which makes sense, and we've got seasonality, but it's broken seasonality. And we have some interesting, everybody kind of having some story of some one-off behaviors with fees and when and how they're applied. That's what's really jumping out to me in this one.
Yeah, I agree. The comparison here is the August registrations were up tremendously. We'll see that in just a minute for childcare, and of course that affected the overall composition. I think this graph does a good job kind of displaying that. So with with that, we're going to open it up to some conversation. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A that have popped up that we'll talk through, but in the meantime, I want to open up a question to our audience and say, okay, now that you've seen these trends, what resonates with you? What action items do you want to take from this? What are some ways that you can reimagine revenue sources based off of the trends, and kind of share it with the group? So go ahead and type in those answers. And in the meantime, I will ask some of the questions. So the first is, gross revenues are up because of school age program, but how is net income affected? Membership has a large gross margin, but what about programs?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this this is also a big, my goodness, we can have so many great breakout conversations around this. But there's two really important things that come to mind with that question. One is, hit the nail on the head. The implication of that question is probably clear, but I'm just going to state it for the record. Programs cost more. There's staffing. There's all of the operational costs that come with programs. They are typically more expensive than the general membership fitness floor type experience. It scales with cost differently. And then in terms of gross revenue net, like what does this truly mean for net? That is something that we talk about with customers and Ys and Js a lot. We don't have currently expenses logged in operations, so we can speak somewhat anecdotally or qualitatively from a trend perspective with this, which is that many of the pieces that we have around our facilities and managing and maintaining our facilities have not decreased because the facility still exists. What has been affected, and I think it's a heavy heart story, is the number of paid staff, full and part-time, has certainly been part of this calculation, which we know, and it's a very difficult topic and conversation, and we know that has changed. And so the third thing that I would say, I said there were two. The third thing that I would say is, because programming has been reimagined, we're still learning and hearing from our customers around how that may be affecting their costs to implement those. Because we talk about broken seasonality. If your program offerings in the fall are often, say you're using last year or the last time you did a program like this to estimate your cost or your overhead to run it, that may now be completely re-envisioned as well, where we have to offer, day programming in the fall, for one example. And of course, we know it's very common to say, hey, how can we stretch resources while we do that? So I don't have an answer, except to be frank, because we don't have the quantitative data from operations to dig into that. But I can say that those trends have probably not surprisingly surfaced from our discussions with our partners and our Ys and our Js.
Awesome. Well, as a reminder, everyone be chatting in some ideas on ways to reimagine revenue sources. In the meantime, I'm going to keep us moving along with talking about check-ins. Mm-hmm. So total check-ins are at 42% back compared to, that was supposed to say September. That's my bad.
I see it looks like, it was 35 and a half. You can see over there. There's always that fun. Yeah. It went up month over month as well.
Yes, it went up month over month in multiple ways, in percent back to normal and compared month over month.
Yes.
Before we kind of dig into looking at that deeper, wanted to talk about what all is included when we say a check-in, because checking in is a little different these days.
It is. So if you log it as a check-in in operations, it's counted as a check-in. We try to, for consistency's sake, keep that answer as consistent as we can, meaning logged in ops, it's counted. And that would include virtual check-ins. And so we have seen, again, and heard about and talked about with our Ys and our Js, and our product team has done such a great job with this, knowing how it's being used to understand, hey, what does that mean when we see a check-in? What behavior does that mean? Because we'll be talking to one of our wonderful Y or J partners, and we'll know they're closed and they're logging some check-ins. And it's because two things are happening. Like they're delivering virtual content, or there's some kind of, maybe it's not logged as a virtual check-in because there is that option in operations. It could be that they know that they are delivering content virtually and they are manually going over here and logging in to count attendance or to count something, of participation in that way. So we see everything from hey, we're going to offer this class on YouTube or through, whatever virtual experience it may be. And while we're here, I see Christy's here, I see, John's over here, Ben's over here. I'm going to count them and check them in, so to speak, all the way to they've created a virtual branch location and memberships around it, or actual virtual programming, and they're truly treating or automating it or having members check in. This also, I should say, very clearly does include in-person facility check-ins. So it is the expanded definition of how our customers are choosing and our partners are choosing to define check-in. It's all of those things, just based on how that function's being leveraged.
Well, let's take a look at how we're tracking along with year or month over month check-ins and that. And kind of dig into what we are seeing by revenue size, because I think we've told the story, but it continues to be a story. What are the main takeaways for you?
I actually think I'm a little biased. This might be my favorite visual of us digging into the data, and it's because as someone who is trying to look and see what, as much as we can tell, to bring as much of context as we can to the numbers that we're seeing. When there's a graph like this this tells a very clear trend, and clear trends we can in turn be clear with what's going on about. So if you look at those trend lines, and this is broken up by revenue size, if you've got a squint to read that legend at the bottom there, forget what the breakouts are for just a second. The story is, no matter what size of an organization or association you are, that trend line after May is almost the same. So for instance, you'll see that, like, hey, if you're that bottom line, we don't have much option to overlap. They are running in parallel, which means the overall number of check-ins may vary greatly by where you are and how, your size, but the trend of behavior of checking in, of engaging with a Y or a J, or another one of our partners, is very consistent month to month. So the trend line, if I go up 1 month, everybody's going up 1 month. If I go down a little bit, everybody's going down a little bit. That curve is very consistent, which is very interesting. Secondly, of course, is there are obvious differences in numbers, not by size. So you would think, since this is a total chart, that the larger the organization, the more the check-ins, the smaller totals, the smaller. That's not what this graph is showing. If you can't read what it means, the highest one there is truly the largest associations and organizations. That makes sense. Again, kind of going back to the biggest number served in the most number of communities across locations, all of that makes sense. The next one, though, is not the next technically largest group. It's the smallest group. And so this tends to be, and I think a continuing theme that we see, is that oftentimes there is a great story emerging from this. And it is the fact that in both the case of the independent or the maybe the small number of locations association and the large, they have one very important thing in common, which is that they are often one of the biggest organizations serving that community. So in a time of the pandemic, both of them are serving a very similar function, just on different scales, right? And in different sizes of communities. So it is not uncommon what we're seeing. And let me put that in very real terms. You can be in a smaller, you can have one location or two locations and be in a smaller area population density wise. And because of that, though, because so many of our Ys and our Js kept serving their community and needed, had a role to play through since March, they have seen that level of activity, so to speak, remain high. That, of course, is the same when you have a large organization that services across several communities. So it's very, it's a really good stories of some real life examples. That sounds a little academic, what I said, but essentially what that means is if you're in a really big area or really small area, like you've had your doors open, even if it's virtually, and you're serving your community. And it is examples of really being like, hey, we need the Y right now because, or the J right now, or whatever it is, in our community, to be of service, and all the other examples that we can put to this. But
I think that's a great point. It has always kind of been interesting to me that 0 to 3 million is in close, but you are trending across all revenue sizes very similarly. So there are habits evolving and coming out for what our members are doing. We had a great question that you touched on, but wanted to dig in a little bit. But do you have silver sneakers in the check-in details?
yes, and so here's where I'm going to repeat that wonderful answer I said earlier about logging and operations. They are not removed from operations. We have seen, so if you as a Y or a J are logging them there, we have not removed them. We do have some behavior that we're seeing in the front end of the system. And again, this is a personal implementation choice, where maybe they are choosing not to log those check-ins. And so we don't have a way to capture that difference of choice except by conversations, when we're asking, or when our partners have reached out to us about that choice. The same actually holds true for revenue. We certainly see different ways to implement or to track silver sneakers as it applies to a GL you would attach it to. Sometimes we see that set up as a subsidy. I will say, when I talk about data with anyone who works in finance at a Y or a J, I think maybe the top question I get is, can I see that data with silver sneakers removed? Probably mention that often, but it is such a common use case to include or not to include, how to count, how to show it, maybe next to it. And so really to keep it easier, like we do have ways, if you happen to be, just as I mentioned, if you happen to be a performance analytics user, or to have made, to have taken advantage of when we have that kind of available to folks this year, that is one of the most common setups is, hey, let's click that and just look at that data, or let's quickly exclude that and look at the same information. Long answer to say that however you have chosen to log or not log it, we haven't gone in and done that for you here. So it would simply reflect your particular choice in that area. It's mostly included. We do see some examples where they're choosing not to log in that way.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions you have about check-ins, go ahead and send them in and we'll dig in, but we're going to change topics a little bit and talk more about membership. We've hinted at it throughout the conversation, but wanted to dig in and see how we are tracking month over month compared back to normal.
Yes.
And you'll see they look pretty similar. And if you were with us last webinar, they were actually also very similar. So I wanted to open up and see what are some major trends you're noticing here, Constance.
Yeah, so the major trend, and I think we were going back to kind of reporting immediately when COVID first started to really impact the closures. I mean, I keep mentioning March. That was March and April. This was when this started. There was very much an effort, and I think some of you may have seen Ron's videos where he kind of was talking about the score of the game. Like, where are we? If we start at 100 points, so to speak, how many do we have left on the board? What is kind of fascinating, again, from a data perspective on here, is this is really stabilized after it settled, so to speak. We hover in this region. We've seen it since about June. It will change again. This is not where we land. And again, as a reminder, this one's not month to month, it's year over year, because again, of that seasonality. We know we've got seasonal monthly churn that we see in terms of active members. The other thing, not to be understated, continues to be a headline, has been all year, is hold behaviors. So 2 important things to know about holds. This very much says active units on purpose, because we know that in terms of revenue behavior, we collect revenue and dues off of active units. If it's on hold, it is very unusual to also be, for instance, tying that to revenue of any kind. So we still have large number of units on hold, and not only on hold, but going on and off hold. So we see that, and this is something that we surfaced in the COVID views, movement almost daily. It was daily in the earlier months of this year. Now we tend to see it around still billing cycles. So I would just, it's expected given that we've settled into this behavior for in addition to terminations. Just two headlines. I know we're going to talk about it in the next view. Some stabilization of year over year where we kind of settled, but then also knowing that hold behavior is affected in this, and these aren't all terminations. So keep that in mind. It's not that we kept only 78% and the rest have terminated. It's a mix of that hold behavior, again, to either as an effort to retain or to not bill, as well as terminations.
I think that's a great point. I wanted to dig in and look, before we look at the holds, about active units a little bit deeper by revenue size. So I wanted to pull that up here and kind of talk through some main takeaways. We see a very similar story to what we were seeing in the other buckets of revenue and then check-ins, and we see a similar trend as far as the $20 million plus kind of being a hard hitter.
Yep.
What are some of your thoughts around this view?
Yeah, so and you'll see it in the next visual that we're about to say, so it's a teaser for that. I mentioned holds. The largest organizations, which are all the way on the right there, also have our largest percentage of holds. So know that is disproportionately at play in the year-over-year comparisons. They have a largest proportion of everything. It makes sense. You've got a bigger service area, larger membership types. It's just going to be the biggest examples of most of what we see. There's that. The other thing is we continue to have this dynamic, which is fascinating, about the next common behavior that we see in terms of size is actually our smaller independent Ys and Js. That's this trend of biggest and then smallest and then kind of mid-size, variations of mid-size, that we have seen that since June. It is very settled behavior because of what we mentioned earlier about their particular, honestly, service area is probably the best way to kind of sum up all of the things I would love to say about how they're serving their communities. Is the story here as well. One last thing I would say is that much like the rest of the data, what is again really important to note is that the numbers are different, the trend's the same. So if you look across at these bars, they're moving in the same direction. They may have different totals on them or percentages on them depending on what we're looking at. But except for the order of like very large, relatively small and mid, which continues to be a trend, the data movement itself is another example of a consistent behavior in terms of, in this case, active units compared to last year.
Perfect. I want to dig into the image you've been mentioning of the percent back to normal. Yes. So we have percent back to normal by revenue size for each of the kind of major components of membership. Something not on here, but I think is interesting to point out is that this is a year-over-year comparison. If we're doing a month-over-month comparison, new joins did increase 22% and terminations decreased 33%. So
yes,
that's kind of been a consistent month-over-month trend line, which is exciting. But when we're comparing back to normal, what are some main takeaways here on this page?
Okay, so I said that the check-in graph was my favorite, and I realized I misspoke. It's this one. I take it back. This really, if we think about, there's so much we can dig into data. At its core, it is counts of people and counts of revenue for very good reasons. So the impact of like why those counts change is everything. However, when we look at this encapsulates it is the underlying, the domino effect, if you will, of the revenue story that we told up front at the beginning of this webinar, in addition to childcare. So we talked a lot about childcare and fees, absolutely the headline there. Also, what's on this page. And so what's on this page? The bigger the organization, the bigger the number of holds, quite largely. I can't overstate. I mean, there's a big difference between, hey, we are doing 400% year over year holds to we're doing 1200% year over year holds, compared to normal, so to speak. You'll also notice it moves completely opposite in terms of terminations. So the more holds you have, comparatively, the less terminations you have. However, here's the big however, look at the active unit count. So you may have, the more holds you have, the less terminations you have. However, again, right now, and this would stand to reason, the more you have on hold, the less is going to be active. There's been a trade-off of behavior here, meaning that the smaller the organization may have experienced higher rates of termination. They also have the highest number of active units compared to year over year. So this is truly, and you'll see this, that it's reflective of choices that's being made for retention. And it's both of those things are important storylines. So if we just looked at active units, we may think like, wow, those smaller, those one location organizations or two location associations, whatever they may be, there's a story there. Like they have 88% of their active units. That is by far the largest grouping that we can find, and we kind of segment data. Why is that? Well, interestingly enough, they've experienced the highest number of terminations, but they've also kept their members largely active comparatively, put less on hold. Still a lot more compared to normal, but less on hold. That was different behavior than we saw in not only larger organizations, but larger areas. And so this is, kind of neutral information. It doesn't mean that they made a better choice. We don't know yet. It has to be tied to revenue, right? This would have to be tied to, in addition, what does that mean for your membership fees? What does that mean for your membership revenue? But what we do know is that the active unit counts are directly one-to-one relationship to your holds, but it's also had a domino effect to termination rates. So when those holds come off, I think everybody on the call knows this as well as we do, better than we do. They're experts that can start talking on this. The reason why they're still on hold is to, one, serve as many people as possible, and then retain as many members as possible, and hopefully when they come off hold, move to that active column and not the termination column. So that is very much stating something I know that everyone on this call knows intimately well. But I do want to call out that those trend lines are moving in interesting ways. The fact that the hold and terminations are opposite, but have also have that potential retention story on top of it that we're watching is important, because it is not necessarily the case that the data is going to bear out that a hold has saved a termination. We simply don't know that yet. In fact, some early behavior around here would suggest that it may be neutral.
Yeah, I think as I dig into the data each month, new views pop into my head that I want to see, because there's so many ways to slice and dice data. I'm interested, and I'm taking this as my own action item, everyone on the call, to view, have a view of what that looks like, similar to check-ins, how we're able to compare month over month what that looks like, knowing these trends for active members and total revenue, to see if there's a correlation there. So I think, like you said, holds are something that we just kind of keep watching, because they're a major player in the membership story right now.
Yes, and I will say, just one thing I would add to that is we're also starting to see different ways of having a concept of being on hold. We've actually been working with more than one association who's chosen to keep a member or group of members active and put them in what is being called a hold discount group. So to keep their active count in a different place, because it's a different way they want to look at their KPIs. And so I think just knowing that the story of holds is pretty clearly going to stay a story, we're also starting to see, okay, as we settle into beyond recovery, different phases of recovery, to trying to move forward and grow and thrive as an organization, like what it will mean in terms of membership types, what it will mean in terms of membership fees, is truly a lot of the conversations that I know that our Ys and RJs are having now.
Yeah. This is great and a great thing to think through. I wanted to take the last 15 minutes of our time to talk about the last quarter category and then open it up to Q&A. I want to dig into registrations because
Yep.
that's playing a major influence over our revenue right now.
Mm-hmm.
So as we see here for September, registrations are significantly higher for childcare compared to last year.
Mm-hmm.
I think this plays into the story we were saying at the beginning, but one thing to note is programs look healthier than August compared to last year for September. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain with these as well.
Well, again, I get excited whenever the data is this consistent. We mentioned at the top of this that the story around revenue was childcare. It is bears out. We can dig into it. We keep finding that as the answer. So that is the clarity is just important to kind of punctuate, because sometimes that story requires, deeper, hey, is there something else? Are we missing something? And it is very clearly what we have happening at this point for the reasons that you said at the top of the discussion. So you asked about programs. So programs right now outside, so if we separate the concept of why these two numbers would be both better but different, it's very much another example of one of the responding to the needs in the community looking different this September than it looked last September. Right. The classic example that I mentioned earlier, but I just love some of these stories that are coming in are around, moving from what was last year before in school age childcare. It is, we're calling it school age care, and it's now during the day, or it's something that is helping our community with virtual learning if they have that track, or if as their schools open and close, or whatever the needs of the community may be. The same thing has happened with programs. So what would have been a seasonal fall program that would have kicked off in September, been registered for in September, has now obviously been changed as the needs of the community have changed, but also to the excellent question that was asked earlier, if we're operating within resource constraints, if we're operating with less staff, potentially less spend for our programs, we're choosing to put it in childcare because we're responding, our Ys and OJs are responding to the needs. And so some of this is resource shifting. And some of it is truly saying, hey, we've got resources to deliver childcare camp and programming right now to our community. What do they need? That mix this September is different than last September. And so that's where I would say registration rates, that is driving some of this. It's not simply, hey, we've got a lot of interest in childcare now and maybe less. It's that operational choices, less than other programming, it's that operational choices are being made to say, hey, this is what's most important right now. And then these programs over here, we're really going to focus on the ones that potentially we can offer virtually, or that are our subsidy programs, or that are now going to be, two of them are combined. And all of that is at play. There's one thing that I really don't want to forget to mention, which is around both check-ins and programs. You will now see a concept of capacity. There's always been a concept of capacity in some way. We can't have 1,000 people register for whatever. Maybe we can't. I hope someone has a great story about registering 1,000 signups for a program. That would be wonderful. But there are sometimes caps on registrations that we're seeing as well. Maybe last year there were either enough resources or spaces or just social distancing best practices where there were going to be 30 people in whatever that program was going to be. And now it's not just a resourcing question, but it's a social responsibility one, where we are choosing to distance to participate in that program. And we've cut the cap for registrations of that down to 15 instead of 30. So that is another trend that I haven't mentioned yet. I would be remiss in not bringing it up, because that's also something that's a story.
And to that point, we actually had a question about varying based off of the geographic locations, because
Yes,
Janine said that, and say the southeast or the northeast versus the southeast, those numbers are going to look drastically different. So
absolutely.
when you see 160% back to normal, that may not resonate with you based off of where you are and based off of like what your reopening status is.
You should really book 2 hours for this one sometime, because these are exactly right. And I think I would really like to thank her for bringing that up, because one of the things that this conversation sits in every time we have it is levels of closure, is geographical, both choices around opening. Sometimes that is, we have some really interesting stories from communities where they're technically allowed to be open, and they have the community would, for instance, not penalize that in any way, but they have chosen from a responsibility standpoint, from a health standpoint, to limit access to keep people safe. And so there's that happening, as well as the excellent example of Northeast versus, let's say, Southeast or Southwest, two areas of the country which are having very different experiences in terms of mandated closures or mandated behavior. And so we have a combination of mandation in terms of mandation, that's came across that, but mandated closures, different levels of delivery, certainly options for facilities versus virtual programs are at play, but absolutely geographic, as well as leadership choices around the best way to be virtual or to limit access to keep people safe.
Yeah. I'm going to dig in one more view and then open it up to the Q&A. And this is just a comparison by revenue size, which we did have a question, and this is I wanted to ask this before maybe opening it up totally, but what are your thoughts on why the $9 to $20 million are what appears by the data being pretty hard hit, if not the most hard hit?
Yeah, so that is thank you for asking that, because I know that so much of the data is pointing to as you mentioned, our larger and our comparatively smaller organizations. It is right for us to say, hey, what's going on in the middle? So one of the things that we see is that of these size, kind of mentioned, this won't apply to everyone, but on the whole, these tend to be in areas that have somewhat other options. So it may be in a suburban area where there's also, another organization that may be I hate to use the word competition, but may also be serving the community in some way. Similarly, and there's that. But then there is also the fact that since they are having to meet the same needs that the very large organizations are having. Oftentimes, if they are in a suburban area, sometimes we are seeing it impact. We are seeing it impact their numbers in the same way. It's just the fact that their overall where they started point was a little bit different. So their comparison data isn't as large, let's say, use the statistical term, the N isn't as big. And so the impact to them sometimes, honestly, even though these numbers look different, if I'm working in one of those organizations, it may feel very similar. They may say, hey, our numbers aren't popping there, but we're experiencing the same trends. It's just that their starting point and their end point aren't as wildly different as we are seeing in the very pronounced kind of use cases that are coming out of the the other two examples that we've been talking about. So I would say that the data would actually bear out that the experiences are similar. And then there's two important points to know. One is the types of organizations, again, the types of communities that they serve. There may be a mix. It may not be the only game in town, and they're not the biggest. And so that's going to have some effect on operations always, not now. And they actually are experiencing the same trends. It's just because the numbers aren't so wildly different based on where they started, the trend lines are actually moving the same. They're just moving a little bit at a lower rate.
Right. That was a great question, and thank you for asking it, because that was a helpful way to understand. Because if you look at it, you can be like, and you're in that range, it can be disheartening, but there's a reason, there's a story there to explain it. So, so last thing is, go ahead and submit any final questions that you have, just as people are sending in their final thoughts. One thing that I wanted to remind you is that if you are looking at this and saying, okay, this looks great, but how does it compare to my data? Our performance analytics app actually allows you to really make that comparison, dig in deep, and see how you are trending on each of these topics for your association or agency, and really be able to compare at an even deeper level than what we are providing at the large trend, but be able to compare yourself daily to your peers, to other areas of size and composition, revenue makeup. So I highly encourage you, if you guys are interested, to reach out to us at marketing@daxco.com. One last question, and if you guys have any more, go ahead and send them our way. But do we have any data on virtual learning, or is that included in childcare statistics?
Yeah, that is, oh my goodness. I love these discussions. I want to keep them going. So for virtual learning, I'm going to go back to that tried and true answer of depending on how it's set up in the front end of operations. So depending on how it's set up in the front end of operations, if there's programming related to virtual learning, it is most commonly being created as a camp and childcare program. So exactly like check-ins, where we see, hey, some of those are in person, some of those are manually being done by staff because of the way that they're interacting with members, and same goes for the answer to this question. So there definitely are programs that we are absolutely aware of. I'm sure some of you on this call have wonderful stories about them, offering them yourselves. And typically, again, the most common answer that we're seeing is that it is set up as a program in the front end of the system in the camp and childcare module of operations, and then it's simply, it's named something. It's named something that's like, virtual school age care, or Y Academy, or other offerings like that. Now, if the question is, hey, we're offering virtual programming and we're actually not together in person, for that delivery, and the delivery is virtual learning. And I just want to mention that because I know oftentimes when we're doing virtual learning through schools, sometimes there's a component of both. Resources that are available virtually, and sometimes there's programs that have nothing to do with school, and we're talking about learning, where the delivery, as we've mentioned earlier, is virtual. And that will just, I think, where we're seeing some of those trends again. It's typically in the name of the program itself. Right? Right. So it will say, or as I mentioned earlier, we have some Ys and Js who've actually opened up a virtual location, or have created a virtual membership type, or have named this, this is our virtual learning program. And so that is where we are really seeing, just, obviously that type of keeping track is important in order to be able to answer questions like this. The short answer is, we're most commonly seeing anything to do with virtual learning named something similar in childcare and camp. The long answer is, much like the other ones, depending on what it is and why it's considered virtual, it may be in another section of operations.
Yeah. Well, Constance, thank you so much for your time today. What we'll be doing is, by this day next week, I'll get you a recording out so you can share some of these thoughts with people on your team, and I'll make sure that the downloaded PDF is on the website as well, so you can share that with your teammates as well. If you have any questions, please let us know at marketing@daxco.com. We're always happy to get you connected with the right people to get you the right answer, or I'll answer the questions. So thank you guys for your time today, and thank you, Constance, for digging in. You have such great knowledge of the data that we're seeing, and it is helpful to hear from your eyes.
It's a pleasure. I often say I can often probably clearly talk about this a lot. So thank you all for participating today, and we really appreciate your time and your feedback and all the work that you're doing.
Yep. Well, have a great day, everyone. See ya.